I almost destroyed every photo, every document, and every file on my computer, doing something that millions of people attempt every single year. And most of them get it catastrophically wrong. What I'm about to walk you through saved me from that exact disaster, and if you follow it the way I did, it will save you too. This is not a quick tutorial pieced together from random forum posts. This is the actual process, step by step, mistake by mistake, of installing Linux alongside Windows 11 on a real machine. The safe way, the way that does not put your data at risk, the way that lets you keep Windows fully intact while opening the door to an entirely different operating system living right next to it. If you've ever been curious about Linux but terrified of breaking your computer, stay with me, because by the end of this, you will know exactly what to do and exactly what to avoid. Let's start with why anyone would even want to do this in the first place. Windows 11 has been pushing people toward a breaking point for a while now. The hardware requirements alone have left millions of perfectly capable computers labeled as unsupported. The TPM 2.0 requirement, the secure boot mandates, the increasingly aggressive integration of advertising, telemetry, and AI features baked directly into the operating system for a lot of users, especially the ones who grew up customizing their PCs and actually controlling what their machine does. This has felt like a slow erosion of ownership. You don't fully own your computer anymore. Microsoft does, in a meaningful sense, and it reminds you of that constantly. Linux, on the other hand, represents the opposite philosophy entirely. It's open source, which means the code that runs the operating system is publicly available for anyone to inspect, modify, and improve. There's no corporation deciding what features get pushed onto your desktop. There's no forced telemetry collection running in the background. There's no built-in advertising in your start menu. And there are dozens of different versions called distributions or distros, each one built with different priorities, different interfaces, and different levels of complexity. So there's genuinely something for almost every type of user, from absolute beginners to hardcore programmers who want granular control over every process running on their machine. But here's the thing that stops most people before they even start. The fear of breaking something, the fear of losing years of files, the fear of ending up with a computer that won't boot at all. And that fear is not irrational. It comes from real horror stories. People who wiped their entire hard drive by accident. People who corrupted their Windows installation while trying to resize a partition. People who got stuck in a black screen with a blinking cursor and no idea how to recover. These stories are real, and they happen, because most tutorials skip the careful, deliberate steps that actually prevent disaster. So before we touch a single setting, I want to walk through exactly what dual booting means, why it's actually a very safe process when done correctly, and then we'll go through the entire installation from start to finish. Dual booting simply means having two separate operating systems installed on the same physical computer, where you choose which one to load every time you turn the machine on. Windows 11 stays exactly where it is, completely untouched, with all your existing files, programs, and settings intact. Linux gets installed into its own separate space on the same hard drive, or even better, onto a completely separate drive if you have one. When you restart your computer, a boot menu appears, asking you which operating system you want to use that session. Pick Windows, you're in Windows, doing everything you normally do. Pick Linux, you're in Linux, exploring a completely different environment. Nothing is overwritten, nothing is deleted. Both systems coexist peacefully on the same machine. The reason this method is considered the safest way to try Linux is because it eliminates the single biggest risk that virtual machines and other testing methods can't fully replicate: real hardware performance. Running Linux inside a virtual machine on top of Windows is safe, sure, but it's also slow. It doesn't give you genuine access to your graphics card, and it doesn't let you feel what Linux is actually like day to day. Dual booting gives you the real experience, with real speed, real hardware acceleration, and real usability, while keeping a complete safety net in the form of your fully functional Windows installation sitting right there if anything goes wrong or if you simply decide Linux isn't for you. Now, before we get into the actual installation, there's one step that is more important than every other step combined, and skipping it is the single most common reason people end up losing data during this process. Back up your files. I don't care how confident you feel. I don't care how many times you've done this before. Back up everything that matters before you touch your partition table. Use an external hard drive. Use a cloud storage service, use whatever method works for you, but get a complete copy of your important documents, photos, videos, and anything else you cannot afford to lose, stored somewhere completely separate from the internal drive you're about to modify. This single step is what separates a safe experiment from a potential disaster, and it costs you nothing but a little bit of time. With that out of the way, let's talk about choosing your Linux distribution, because this decision matters more than people realize when they're just starting out. If you are coming from Windows and you want the gentlest possible transition, Linux Mint is widely considered one of the best starting points that exists. It has a desktop layout that feels instantly familiar. A start menu in the corner, a taskbar at the bottom, system tray icons on the right. So your muscle memory from years of using Windows largely transfers over without much friction. It's also incredibly stable, well documented, and has one of the most supportive beginner communities in the entire Linux ecosystem. Another extremely popular option is Ubuntu, which is arguably the most well-known Linux distribution in the world. It's backed by a company called Canonical. It receives consistent long-term support updates, and it has an enormous amount of software compatibility because so many developers build and test their applications, specifically with Ubuntu in mind. The interface is a little different from Windows. It uses a dock on the side, rather than a taskbar at the bottom by default, but it's intuitive enough that most people adjust within a day or two. There are other options too. Fedora, which tends to ship newer software and is favored by developers who want cutting-edge tools. Pop! OS, which is built by a company called System 76 and is particularly well optimized for gaming and creative work. Zorin OS, which goes even further than Mint in mimicking the Windows interface for an extremely smooth visual transition. For the purposes of walking through this installation, I'm going to focus on the general process that applies to virtually any of these distributions, because once you understand the core method, switching between distros for future installs becomes almost trivial. The next step is preparing your installation media, and this means creating what's called a bootable USB drive. You'll need a USB flash drive with at least 8 gigabytes of storage, though I'd recommend something in the 16 gigabyte range, just to have breathing room. First, head to the official website of whichever distribution you've chosen and download the ISO file. This is essentially a complete disk image containing the entire operating system installer. Always download directly from the official website. Never download Linux ISOs from third-party mirrors or random file sharing sites, because there have been instances of tampered images containing malicious code, and the official source is the only one you can fully trust. Once you have the ISO file downloaded, you need a piece of software to actually write that ISO onto your USB drive in a way that makes it bootable. The most widely recommended tool for this is called Rufus, and it's completely free. Download Rufus, plug in your USB drive, open the program, select your USB drive from the device list, select the ISO file you downloaded, and leave the rest of the settings at their defaults, unless you have a specific reason to change them. Click Start, and Rufus will format the drive and write the operating system image onto it. This process typically takes somewhere between 5 and 20 minutes, depending on your USB drive's read and write speeds. Once it's finished, you have a fully bootable Linux installer sitting on a USB stick, ready to go. Now comes one of the most critical preparation steps, and it's the one that protects you from the disaster scenarios I mentioned earlier. You need to create free, unallocated space on your hard drive for Linux to install into, and you need to do this from within Windows itself, using Windows' own built-in disk management tool before you ever boot into the Linux installer. Open the Windows search bar and type in Create and Format Hard Disk Partitions. This will open the Disk Management utility. You'll see your hard drive listed, typically showing your Windows partition labeled as the C drive, along with any recovery partitions and other system partitions Windows has created. Right-click on your main C drive partition and select Shrink Volume. And Windows will calculate the maximum amount of space it can free up, and then you specify how much space you want to shrink, measured in megabytes. For a comfortable Linux installation with room to install software and store files, I'd recommend shrinking somewhere between 50 and 100 gigabytes, though if you have a smaller drive, even 30 gigabytes will get you a functional experience. After you enter the amount and click Shrink, Windows will create a block of unallocated space right next to your Windows partition. This is crucial. Do not format this unallocated space. Do not assign it a drive letter. Do not do anything else with it. Just leave it as raw, unallocated space. The Linux installer will recognize this empty space during installation and use it to create its own partitions. This single step, shrinking your Windows partition from within Windows itself before touching anything else, is exactly why this method is considered safe. You are creating room for Linux without deleting or modifying a single existing file on your Windows installation. Your operating system, your programs, your documents, all of it remains completely untouched throughout this entire process. Before you reboot into the installer, there's one more setting you need to check, and it involves something called Secure Boot and Fast Startup. In your Windows settings, search for Fast Startup and disable it if it's enabled. Fast Startup essentially puts Windows into a hybrid hibernation state rather than fully shutting down, and this can cause file system conflicts when a Linux installation tries to access the same drive. Disabling it ensures a completely clean shutdown every time. Secure Boot is a bit more nuanced. It's a security feature built into modern UEFI firmware that only allows verified, signed operating systems to boot on your machine, and it's part of why Windows 11 has such strict hardware requirements in the first place. The good news is that most major Linux distributions, including Ubuntu and Linux Mint, are signed in a way that's compatible with Secure Boot. So in many cases, you won't need to touch this setting at all. However, if you run into boot issues during installation, you may need to enter your motherboard's UEFI or BIOS settings, usually accessed by pressing a key like F2, F10, F12, or delete repeatedly as your computer starts up, and either disable Secure Boot temporarily or look for a Linux-compatible mode if your manufacturer offers one. I'll mention this again later in case you hit a snag, but for most modern systems and modern distributions, this isn't an obstacle you'll need to overcome. With your USB drive prepared, your Windows partition shrunk, and fast startup disabled, you're ready for the actual installation. Restart your computer with the USB drive plugged in, and as your machine starts booting, you need to access the boot menu, which is typically done by pressing a specific key repeatedly, right as the computer powers on. This key varies by manufacturer. It's often F12, F11, F9, or Escape. And if you're not sure, a quick search for your specific motherboard or laptop model will tell you exactly which key to press. Once you're in the boot menu, select your USB drive from the list of boot options rather than your internal hard drive, and your computer will load the Linux installer instead of Windows. You'll be greeted with a live environment, which means the Linux operating system is actually running directly from the USB drive without having installed anything yet. This is actually a fantastic feature because it lets you explore the operating system, test whether your Wi-Fi works, check if your graphics look correct, and generally get a feel for things before committing to a permanent installation. Take a few minutes here. Open a web browser, check your internet connection, look at how the desktop feels. If everything seems to be working correctly, you'll see an icon on the desktop, typically labeled Install with the name of your distribution. Double-click that icon, and the installation wizard begins. The first few screens are usually straightforward, selecting your language, your keyboard layout, and your time zone. Then you'll often be asked whether you want to download updates and install third-party software during the installation. Things like media codecs for playing certain video and audio formats. I generally recommend checking these boxes if you have an internet connection, since it saves you from having to manually install this software later. Then comes the most important screen in the entire process, the installation type screen. This is where the safety of dual booting either gets executed correctly or gets ruined by a careless click, so pay extremely close attention here. Most modern Linux installers will actually detect that you have Windows already installed, and they'll present you with an option that says something like Install distribution name alongside Windows Boot Manager. This is exactly the option you want. Select it. This option is specifically designed to use the unallocated space you created earlier through disk management, automatically setting up the necessary partitions for Linux without touching your existing Windows partition at all. It typically handles everything automatically, creating a root partition where the Linux system files live, and sometimes a separate swap partition or swap file for memory management. For most users, especially first-timers, this automatic option is exactly what you want because it removes the risk of manual partitioning errors. If you want more control, there's usually a something else or manual partitioning option as well, which lets you specify exactly how much space goes to which partition. I'd only recommend this manual route if you're already comfortable with concepts like partition tables, mount points, and file systems, because this is the one place in the entire process where a mistake can genuinely cause problems. If you select the wrong partition and tell the installer to format it, you could accidentally erase your Windows partition. So unless you have a specific reason to go manuals, and unless you're confident reading the partition list carefully, stick with the automatic install alongside Windows option. It exists specifically to make this process foolproof for exactly this situation. Whichever option you choose, the installer will then show you a summary of the changes it's about to make before actually applying them. This is your last checkpoint to verify everything looks correct. Take a moment. Read through what it says, confirm it's not touching your existing Windows partition in any destructive way, and only then proceed. Once you confirm, the installer asks you to create a user account, set a password, and choose a host name, which is essentially the name your computer will go by on a network. Fill these out, and then the actual installation begins. This process usually takes somewhere between 15 and 45 minutes depending on your hardware speed, particularly whether you have a solid-state drive or traditional spinning hard drive. You'll see a progress bar, along with some background information about features of the operating system you're installing. When the installation finishes, you'll be prompted to restart your computer. Remove the USB drive when prompted, and as your computer boots back up, something new will appear that wasn't there before. A boot menu, usually called GRUB, short for the Grand Unified Bootloader. This is the tool that now manages choosing between operating systems every time you start your computer. You'll see your Linux distribution listed as an option, along with an entry for Windows Boot Manager. Use your arrow keys to select which one you want to boot into for that session, and press Enter. The first time you select your new Linux installation, take a moment because this is the payoff for everything you just did. Your new operating system boots up, fully installed, running directly on your hardware with full performance, completely separate from your Windows installation, which remains exactly as it was. Go ahead and boot back into Windows as well, just to confirm everything is intact. Your files should be exactly where you left them, your programs should open normally, and nothing about your Windows experience should have changed in any way. Now, let's talk about a few things that commonly trip people up after the installation completes, because knowing about these in advance will save you a lot of frustration. The first is what's sometimes called the GRUB takes over situation, where some users discover that after installing Linux, their computer automatically boots into the GRUB menu every single time, rather than going straight to Windows like it used to. This is actually completely normal and expected. GRUB is now your default bootloader, sitting in front of both operating systems, asking you to choose every single time you start the computer. If you find this menu appearing for too long, or if you want to change the default selection, you can usually edit GRUB's configuration to set a different default operating system, or adjust the timeout duration so it doesn't wait as long before automatically booting into whichever option is selected. The second common issue involves Wi-Fi drivers, particularly on laptops with certain wireless chipsets, most notably some Broadcom and Realtek chips that don't have built-in open-source drivers and require proprietary drivers to function correctly. If you find that your Wi-Fi isn't working immediately after installation, don't panic. This is a well-documented issue with well-documented solutions. Most distributions have a built-in tool for managing additional drivers, often called additional drivers or something similar in the system settings, where you can search for and install the correct proprietary driver for your specific hardware. Alternatively, connecting via an Ethernet cable temporarily will give you internet access to search for and download the specific driver your hardware needs. The third issue that occasionally comes up involves NVIDIA graphics cards. Linux has historically had a more complicated relationship with NVIDIA hardware compared to AMD or Intel graphics, primarily because NVIDIA's drivers are proprietary rather than open source. Most modern distributions handle NVIDIA driver installation reasonably well these days, often prompting you during installation or shortly afterward to install the recommended proprietary driver. If you experience graphical glitches, screen tearing, or poor performance, head into your distribution's driver management tool and make sure you're using the recommended proprietary NVIDIA driver rather than the open source default, which sometimes has more limited functionality. The fourth thing worth knowing about is time synchronization issues that can occur specifically in dual boot setups. Windows and Linux handle hardware clock settings slightly differently, and some users notice their system clock is incorrect after switching between the two operating systems. This is a known quirk and easily fixed with a setting change, usually involving telling Windows to use coordinated universal time, which Linux already defaults to, ensuring both systems stay synchronized correctly. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the fear that probably brought a lot of you to this video in the first place. What happens if something goes wrong? What if you boot up, and instead of the GRUB menu, you get an error message or a black screen, or your computer simply won't start? First, take a breath, because in the vast majority of cases, this is recoverable. And it's recoverable specifically because you follow the dual boot method rather than wiping your drive entirely. If GRUB fails to load properly, in many cases, your Windows installation remains completely intact on the drive, simply inaccessible because the bootloader managing the startup process has an issue. There are repair tools, including boot repair utilities that can be run from a live USB environment that scan your drive and rebuild a functional boot configuration without touching your actual operating systems or data. This is yet another reason why creating that bootable USB drive earlier serves a dual purpose. It's not just your installer, it's also your emergency recovery tool if anything about the bootloader goes sideways. If, after everything, you decide Linux simply isn't for you. Removing it and reclaiming the space for Windows is also a fairly clean process. You can boot into Windows, use disk management again, delete the Linux partitions, which will free up that space, and then extend your Windows partition to absorb that newly freed space. You'll also need to run a Windows repair tool to restore the Windows bootloader as the default, since GRUB will have replaced it during the Linux installation. But this is a well-documented process, and there are clear guides for exactly this scenario. The point is, this entire setup is reversible. Nothing about dual booting traps you permanently into anything. So now that you've got Linux up and running alongside Windows, what should you actually expect from the experience day to day? The desktop environment, whichever one you chose, will feel different from Windows in some ways and surprisingly similar in others. File management, web browsing, watching videos, listening to music, all of this works essentially the same way it does on Windows, just through different specific applications. Instead of File Explorer, you might use Nautilus or Nemo depending on your distribution. Instead of Microsoft Edge, you'll likely use Firefox or Chrome. both of which are fully available on Linux with complete feature parity to their Windows counterparts. Software installation works differently than you're used to. Rather than downloading installer executable files from random websites, Linux distributions typically come with something called a package manager, along with a graphical software center, where you can search for and install applications with a single click, much like an app store. This is actually one of the safer aspects of using Linux day to day, since software installed through official repositories has generally been vetted and is less likely to contain malware compared to randomly downloaded executable files. For office work, LibreOffice comes pre-installed on most distributions and offers a complete suite of word processing, spreadsheet, and presentation tools that can open and save in Microsoft Office formats with a high degree of compatibility, though not always perfect for extremely complex documents with advanced formatting. For most everyday documents, the compatibility is more than sufficient. Gaming on Linux has improved dramatically in recent years, largely thanks to a compatibility layer called Proton, developed by Valve, the company behind Steam, which allows a substantial portion of Windows games to run on Linux with little to no configuration required. Many popular titles run at near native performance, though some games with aggressive anti-cheat systems still don't function correctly on Linux. So if gaming is a significant part of your computer use, it's worth checking compatibility databases for your specific favorite titles before relying entirely on Linux for that purpose. For programming and development work, Linux is often considered the preferred environment by a significant portion of the software development world, with native support for countless programming languages, development tools, and command line utilities that either don't exist on Windows or require additional layers like Windows Subsystem for Linux to access. If you're a developer or aspiring developer, this dual boot setup might end up being where you spend the majority of your working time. One of the genuine joys of having both systems available is the freedom it gives you to use the right tool for the right task without compromise. Need a specific piece of software that's Windows only, like certain professional design tools or specialized industry software? Boot into Windows. Want to do some development work, enjoy the privacy benefits, or just explore the customization possibilities that Linux offers? Boot into Linux. You're not locked into a single ecosystem, and you're not making a permanent commitment by trying this out. Over time, many people who start with this dual boot approach find themselves spending less and less time in Windows, eventually using it only for that one specific piece of software they can't replace, while Linux becomes their primary daily driver. Others find a comfortable middle ground, switching back and forth depending on the task at hand. And some people, after genuinely giving Linux a fair try, decide it's not for them and go back to using Windows exclusively, removing the Linux partition entirely. All of these outcomes are completely valid. And the entire point of the dual boot method is that it lets you make that decision based on genuine, real-world experience rather than fear or speculation. What I want you to take away from all of this is that switching to Linux, or at least trying it out properly, doesn't have to be the terrifying all-or-nothing leap that it's often portrayed as. The dual boot method, done correctly, with proper backups, with careful partition management done through Windows' own tools before you ever touch the installer, with attention paid to the installation type screen where you select the alongside Windows option, is genuinely one of the safest ways to explore an entirely new operating system without putting anything at risk. The fear that stops most people isn't really about the technical difficulty of the process, because, as you've just seen, the actual steps are very manageable when broken down properly. The fear comes from uncertainty, from not knowing what to expect, from horror stories of people who skipped steps or rushed through warnings without reading them. But now you know exactly what to do, exactly what each screen is asking of you, and exactly what to watch out for. Your Windows installation stays completely safe throughout this entire process, sitting right there as your familiar, fully functional fallback, while a brand new operating system sits right alongside it, ready for you to explore at your own pace. Whether you end up falling in love with Linux and migrating most of your daily activities over to it, or whether you decide after some experimentation that Windows still suits your needs better, you'll have made that decision based on real, hands-on experience, on a setup that respected your data and protected your existing system every step of the way. And that, more than any specific technical step we walked through, is really the whole point.